So good morning, everyone. Welcome to this special 3-hour Special Education and Pupil Services Leadership Academy session. It's so fantastic to see so many of you here today, and especially considering the weather we've had in the last day or so. It's been a challenge for many of us. We have really a potentially fantastically large crowd with joining us today. So we're going to get this moving as quickly as we can. So excited about today's agenda. As always, this academy is brought to you in collaboration with Regional Special Education Network, the Wisconsin Department of Public Instruction, and the Wisconsin Council of Administrators of Special Services. And we're so thankful to have this collaboration because it makes such a rich conversation for us, and we draw in so many different resources. This is a fantastic series. I'm Chuck Norton. I'm the RSN Director in CISA 5. And just a quick touch on some etiquette, normal meeting etiquette items that we discuss at every session. Please mute your microphone today unless you're asking a question, and certainly we hope that there's going to be opportunity for that. So keep in mind that when we're on the topic of asking questions, you have 3 different options. One is certainly drop things in the chat, and I have a good number of colleagues that are going to be monitoring the chat today. Certainly do that, as well as you can also within our agenda, which thank you to my colleagues again. That link to today's agenda is in the chat, so take a look in there. You can click on that. And within that, you'll find a lot of other links and helpful resources. So you can, as I said, click the mic today, ask a question, drop it in the chat as we normally do in Zoom, or there is even a parking lot document where you can ask those more maybe in-depth questions or questions that weren't quite answered at the segment you wanted to ask them at. If you include within that document your contact information, you will get a direct response. And if you don't, certainly you can check back on that parking lot document and look for information as we either move today's session and or later as we've collected information to answer your question. We invite you to keep your cameras on today because it's so wonderful to see your faces. And part of the reason that we include your CISA number in the renaming yourself on this Zoom link is really because we want to see what areas of the state you're coming from, and it helps us really understand maybe a connection to where you're at and why you're asking certain questions. We're excited again to have so many of you join us today. So let's, I've talked a lot about what's already included in our agenda today. Let's talk a little bit about today's overview of today's agenda. In essence, this is going to be a quite different session compared to what we've had in the past. Generally, we have individual speakers and talking on various segments throughout the day. But I believe our presenters, which is really a dream team of individuals with deep expertise from DPI, joining us today to talk about mental health services and in how they're included in the IEP, and as well as related service providers and how they can complement those resources. So today we have with us Tim Peerenboom, Eva Shaw, Carlin Higby, and Dawn Mirth Johnson. I believe I see all your faces there. So glad to see you guys. Joining us today. They have expertise, obviously, in so many different areas: school psychology, mental health services, itinerant services, speech language pathology. There's just such a wealth of knowledge here. So we're excited to have you with us. Team, since I'm kind of started off the kilter today, have I missed anything? If so, let me know. Okay, I see heads nodding no. So Dream Team, whoever is going to kick this off, you're welcome. So glad to have you here. You're welcome to share your screen and welcome.
Thank you, Chuck. Dream Team. Funny. We are here today. We're going to try and pull off a trick that we've never done before. We had this separated into 2 separate sections, one on mental health in the IEP, and then Dawn and Carlin were going to talk about related services, but we decided there was so much overlap and they relate so closely to each other, we kind of stitched them together as one larger themed session. So hopefully you will be able to follow along with us. We kind of meander a little bit because they are 2 complicated topics that we've woven together here. And I'm going to introduce myself. I'm Tim Peerenboom. I'm the school psychology consultant at the Department of Public Instruction. And I'm going to pass it over to Eva to introduce herself while I get the screen share set up.
Good morning. I'm Eva Shaw. I'm a consultant on the special education team at DPI. And my main roles and responsibilities are around students identified with autism or emotional behavioral disabilities. And I will pass it on to Dawn.
Good morning, everyone. Dawn Mirth Johnson. I am a speech language pathologist, education consultant on the DPI team for the areas of speech and language and assistive technology. And I'll pass to Carlin.
Thank you, Dawn. I'm Carlin Higby, and I am also an educational consultant on the DPI special ed team. And my area of focus is OT and PT.
Hey, just real quickly, everyone, thank you so much for introducing yourselves. Just a reminder that, yes, this is going to be a rather lengthy session that is really all blended together. So around 10:15, we do plan a 15-minute break. So everyone just hang in there. There's a lot of things to cover. And then I also want to welcome our American Sign Language interpreters today. As we stretch ourselves to make sure that we're inclusive and anyone can access this content. We have those individuals with us today. I believe there are two. So welcome to our interpreters today. And back to you guys.
All right, thanks, Chuck. Okay, I see there's a parking lot for questions. I suspect Deb or somebody will be monitoring that. But let's go ahead and get started. So one of the reasons, as I mentioned, there's two pretty complicated topics here. One of the reasons it's so complicated is because what we're trying to do in supporting students' mental health involves a lot of different systems within our larger system. So we're trying to align what we're doing in our multi-level systems of support with our special education processes. The little puzzle piece circle up there is a symbol that we use on our website for our comprehensive special education evaluation. And then many of you, I suspect, are familiar with the CCR IEP process, the College and Career Ready IEP process there on the right. And on the bottom is our model for comprehensive school mental health. So we're going to attempt today to sort of give you a picture of how these things can sort of work with one another in supporting student mental health. And obviously it starts at that universal level. So pulling way back, we want to start with the definition of health. There's no less of an authority that within the last year or so, I believe, no less of an authority than the World Health Organization in their constitution updated their definition of health, as you can see here, to include mental and social well-being, and not just the absence of disease or infirmity, or the absence of, say, a mental health diagnosis. So worldwide, we are now acknowledging mental wellness, social well-being as just part of health. Which is sort of the big reason why it's important to start thinking about this in terms of our universal services in schools, as well as our more targeted or IEP level services at the individual level. Mental health, when we narrow in a little bit on the definition of that, this definition kind of comes from our Wisconsin School Mental Health Framework. This is sort of an offshoot. You see some reflection in, it's not just the absence of mental health. Mental health is, not just not having a diagnosis of depression, or being anxious, or having some other sort of mental health diagnosis, but it is sort of on this spectrum, and it is sort of more encompassing, and it really is more about well-being and wellness. Is this gonna? So when we think of mental health in the schools and mental health supports in the schools, there's certainly good reasons to be setting up systems and supports at that universal level, as you can see here. Lots of research has shown that schools that have comprehensive school mental health systems that are supporting students see an increase in academic achievement in their schools. Students feel more engaged and connected in their schools. More restrictive placements decrease. There's increased access to mental health care. So all of these things, improved school climate, these are the things that we want sort of at that universal level that we think about in terms of signals that we look at for a well-functioning, a high-achieving school or school system are all of these things, that there's a positive climate and culture, that students are engaged. Those are all just general universal things that we look for. And our model in Wisconsin, um, looks like this in terms of comprehensive school mental health. This is not a special education initiative or system. This is again within your multi-level system support, a framework for supporting your students, all students, in their mental health and wellness. So for those of you who are now thinking, but wait, we don't have therapists at our schools that can provide mental health services to our kids. I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Eva, who's going to talk a little bit about who in our systems might be able to support students in their mental health.
All right, thanks, Tim. So when we ask this question, who provides school-based mental health services, our first thought always goes to those school-based mental health professionals, like school counselors, school nurses, school psychologists, social workers, or even credentialed mental health providers that we might contract with. The link on this slide, and I think the slide deck is in your shared folder, it goes to a document that provides an overview of all of these school-based mental health professionals, and it includes information on their knowledge and skills, their licensing information, their role in schools, and the recommended student to provider ratios. And when we started building this together, the four of us, we joked about like who provides school-based mental health services, and we all pointed the finger at each other. My background is as a teacher, as a special education administrator, and I pointed the school psychologist. Certainly, it's his responsibility to provide those school-based mental health services. And Tim, in turn, turned to the OT, Carlin, and said, "Well, occupational therapists have great wealth of knowledge with providing mental health services," who then pointed to Dawn saying, well, speech and language, that's a huge part of providing those services. So we're always turning and pointing to each other and saying, it's not my job, it must be your job, which leads us to the next slide. And that the fact is that it is a team sport. The truth is, it's everybody's job. All of the people and disciplines listed on this slide play a really big role in supporting student mental health. We may not be mental health providers in the sense that we're clinical psychologists or nurse practitioners, but we can all be mental health supporters in a lot of different ways. And some of those ways we're going to talk about throughout this morning. So we know administrators can support that school culture to address that mental health. We have general education teachers who are providing that universal support. Special education teachers, Tim, you can go back a slide and show Ted Lasso again. We can have those special education teachers who are providing SDI and supporting the supplementary aids and services, who also the general education teachers provide. So all of these people listed on this slide are part of that team who can provide mental health services and supports in the school setting. And now we can move to the next slide.
Thank you, Eva. This is Carlin. So many of you at this point might be scratching your head if you've heard Dawn and me or other people in the past talk about related services cannot provide services to students unless they're receiving an IEP. So we're going to talk a little bit about the two laws that govern the role of related service providers, both in special ed and regular education. So again, just to make sure that we have clarity, OTs and PTs and speech therapists cannot provide student-specific evaluative information or supports without being a part of an IEP team. That part's correct. But moving into the ESSA Act, Every Student Succeeds Act, that federal law specifically identifies OTs, PTs, and speech and language practitioners as what's called SISP, Specialized Instructional Support Personnel. And today we're going to talk a little bit about what that looks like and the roles that related service providers can play in that those multi-level systems of support because it's significant. And there's some really interesting data across the country, as Tim talked about earlier. When we see schools with these robust multi-level systems of support, we see students with better mental wellness. So Tim made that distinction between mental wellness and mental health, which is more associated with diagnosis in that sense. And we also see that issue of disproportionality, which we're all very attentive to right now, and that sad but true statistic that students of color and students with disabilities are not realizing the same benefits of educational investments as their peers. So we really need to look at how mental wellness and mental health play a role in all of that. So when we look at, kind of that, it was a funny moment as we were all planning this. We were all like, well, but I thought you really addressed, Tarlin, sensory integration and self regulation. And I thought you addressed this. And we had a great conversation. I think that actually was kind of the turning point when we thought, wow, we need to blend this information so we can, as best as possible, like Tim said, kind of give you that broad picture. So when we think about, um, whose job is it? All four providers, services, special ed, school psychs, and then I'm going to include all related service providers, um, have this role we can play in those school wide approaches to safety and violence prevention and positive behavioral interventions, supports at both secondary and elementary level. There's a lot of information. Connect with your OTs and probably your speech therapist too, depending on each district. We know is different in terms of the personnel resources they have. And I've been in many schools where we don't have school counselors. And so OTs can step up and be a part of this. Speech and language pathologists can step up. We have lots of information in our professional literature about all of this. When we look to, we can go to the next slide. Thanks, Tim. When we look to some guidelines and guidance from the National Alliance for Specialized Instruction. So we've got that regular ed piece, which is ESSA, and then we've got the special ed piece. So we see these, we really loved this kind of visual, this graphic that looks at these 6 points for consideration as we're making sure we've built into our systems those kinds of supports that will be available to all of our students. So, first of all, looking at those barriers to educational success, looking to environmental barriers. I think this slide, we really didn't have time to get into the particular topic of the riot ISIL and the 6 areas of academic and functional performance, which I hope you'll just, if you haven't heard of that, make a note and look those up on the DPI website. I think those frames of reference are very helpful in making sure we're really taking that whole student into consideration as we look at these kinds of barriers. So, environmental barriers, curricular barriers, those kinds of things, and looking at how we can all work as a part of a multidisciplinary team. So, we talk a lot in our IEP, CCR IEP training about that collective responsibility and collaborative approach to assessment, identification of student needs and development of goals, and then how do we collaborate as a team around the development of aligning the services. And so when we think about mental health in particular, we have a broad range of resources. And today's topic, we're going to hope to highlight all of those in a more meaningful way for all of you and maybe have a few light bulbs go off for you.
So a question that Carlin and I get on a weekly basis, if not daily, is can related service providers support MLSS? And the short answer is yes, they can. But what we really need to focus on is how related service providers can be involved in your EMLSS program. There is some guidance that may assist you with ideas on how related service providers play an active role in the systems of support in your district. We've put a couple of references on this slide. One is the role of speech language pathologists in Wisconsin's equitable multi-level systems of support. And the other is guidance related to OSEP's letter to Couillard. Those are both good resources and a good place to start. OTs, PTs, and speech language pathologists may not screen or provide services or interventions directly to students in Wisconsin unless they are identified as having a disability, but they may assist in teams in identifying, creating, monitoring the effectiveness of interventions for students within your equitable MLSS. The OSEP letter does state that occupational and physical therapists may not be assigned to participate as regular members of building consultation teams, and this is because of state licensing and practice rules for these particular professionals. But speech language pathologists and pupil services personnel, such as psychologists, school social workers, school nurses, school counselors, may be assigned as regular team members. And the reason why individualized screenings are not allowed in Wisconsin have to do with due process, funding, and also licensing. In a district's MLSS, speech language pathologists, OTs, and PTs can play a role in providing those district-wide and educator supports like training and program development in each area of that multi-level system of supports by sharing their expertise on topics such as using data to inform instruction, selecting data collection tools, and matching instruction to specific needs. Related service providers can be a valuable asset to your system of supports. We can share knowledge of developmental expectations and some universal strategies that could benefit all students. And this is allowed as part of our involvement in MLSS, and can help to assure that appropriate referrals are received when a student has difficulty in an area. We can say, here are some strategies to try in the classroom. So this is particularly important for you to know in regard to the role OTs can play in developing some of those tier 1 and tier 2 supports for SEL, mental wellness, and also behavioral concerns. It's a large conversation across the country. Carlin has a lot of information on this if you want more, but when OTs are involved in planning and supporting staff in these particular areas, we're seeing a decrease in referrals for OT in special education evaluation. Related service providers play a role in co-teaching. Students can receive incidental benefit from interventions provided in the general education setting for students with IEPs. And page 2 of the OSEP letter talks about some guiding questions to help you determine when a situation may go beyond incidental benefit. On the next slide, we have a chart that lists areas where related service providers can contribute to mental health supports in districts. So beginning at that universal level, the school-wide system of support, prevention, and early intervention. Looking at doing some professional development and training, collaborating with the mental health professionals in your district and other IEP team members, completing assessments when there is a referral for special education evaluation, and doing some direct intervention for those students that are identified as requiring special education, both direct and on behalf of services or indirect services. Let's talk just a moment about language. Mental health and trauma can influence our speech, language, and communication development and our ability to access those skills when we need them. Speech, language, and communication differences or needs can impact mental health and increase risk of trauma. Difficulty communicating needs can feel highly stressful, if not life-threatening, when in that situation. And as we all know, communication is a basic right and a human need. We communicate in order to connect. So speech language pathologists help by providing solutions that can come in the form of strategies, accommodations, understanding, empowerment, and much, much more. There is a high comorbidity of prevalence of children with language impairment in the population of children with emotional behavioral disorders. One meta-analysis study showed that 81% of children with emotional behavioral disorders had below average language skills. And then another study done in 2001 showed as many as 88% of children identified with EBD had never been evaluated for speech or language issues. Also, it's been found that 1 out of 3 children referred for EBD had previous undiagnosed language impairment. So given that co-occurrence between language needs and mental health problems, it's pertinent to ask how we can best support children with children and other young adults with language needs to have good mental health. So while speech language pathologists primarily address communication disorders, their work has a significant impact on the mental health of children by improving communication skills, facilitating social interactions, providing support for emotional well-being, and collaborating with mental health professionals to ensure that a comprehensive approach is used to address the complex needs of children with both communication and also mental health concerns.
Have to turn my mic back on to make this work. So oftentimes I'm asked, well, tell me why the word occupation is used in the title of occupational therapist. And I think this is a great example about how we think of student occupations. Um, we look at their role as a learner. They look at their role as someone who engages in leisure and play, social participation, activities of daily living, and all of those things you see here. And there's a graphic here. The graphic comes from a great program. And please reach out to me if you want more information about it. Thank you for highlighting that, Tim, with the mouse. Um, Susan Basic is an occupational therapist who has national recognition for supporting uh, therapists in learning how we can support our districts. I like to often use the word build capacity. We build capacity in our students to better access and engage and make progress in their educational program, both in the area of social and emotional learning and wellness, as well as physical issues, which I think readily comes to mind when you think about OT and PT. But we also work in this area of student role and mental wellness and mental health. And this program, Every Moment Counts, is if you're looking, I'm not promoting this over any other program, but certainly I would recommend you looking into it if you're looking at some universally designed programs that you can implement in your schools. This is a remarkable program, fairly easy to implement and easy to get information about, and there's no cost, which right now, in this time in our history, that's always good. But I do have other resources for similar programs, so feel free to reach out to me at some point. We can go to the next slide, Tim. So again, that disruption that we're talking about in student roles, so a disruption in our social skills. So a very timely, relevant example is we all have read the press in the press and in the news about how the social disruption that was caused by COVID has impacted our students' social and emotional development and their parents as well, social emotional kind of life in general. That issue of environment, and I think that we can't ignore that. And that's, I think, one of those things where related service providers often come in and they have that training to take that large view picture of the situation that students are in. And we have found so much in our literature about how the environment impacts the success of other strategies that we often are our go to strategies, but implemented in the wrong context, in a not conducive environment, can impact the success of those strategies. Also, I think the thing that comes to mind the most quickly when we think about disruption in student role and then the impact on mental health and mental wellness is just a diagnosis in general. And I think Tim maybe was earlier, but we've all talked about this so much. I don't remember who spoke to it, but we often see that a child has some kind of mental health diagnosis and we panic. And I think it was Eva maybe was saying, and we kind of think, well, I'm not trained to do that, but there are things we can do. So today we'll be talking about that a little bit. But most importantly, we have to be aware how those diagnoses might impact their behaviors. And that's the part we're going to talk about. How do we look at those behaviors? How do we analyze that impact or the barrier that they present to the student's ability to access, engage, and make progress? And then, of course, another obvious one, and this is interesting in terms of the disability advocacy literature, when we talk about physical impairments. And one of the biggest factors, which I find interesting, and I think all of us, when we hear it, we're kind of like, duh, that makes total sense, but we don't often think about it. But it's that issue of teaching our physically disabled students how to self advocate. And there's so much in the literature. And I personally kind of think that we need to, for our students with physical impairments, look at that self advocacy in every single IEP because there's so much that we are hearing back from the adults in the disabilities community that says, I was never taught even how to pick out my own clothes and to make the most basic life decisions. And we know that's so important. So these are those things that OTs, and I think too, this comes from, I don't remember exactly even where Don found this, but these are the kinds of things that related service providers certainly can offer support, along with all of the other people that we've named that are a part of providing those services in both regular ed and special education related to the students' wellness and mental health. So we're just going to take a minute and reflect so that you can think after hearing all of this. We hope that some light bulbs have gone off for you and some ideas about what you might say, oh, wow, we're kind of leaning towards that. Or I can see places where we're actually incorporating some of these ideas that Carlin and Dawn and Tim and Eva are talking about. So we'd like you to put into the chat, take a minute to reflect. If you have some things in your district that are going well and you're like, oh, that really resonates, we're really working towards that. Or if you've kind of have a few takeaways here that like, I need more information about that and I'd like to explore how we could maybe do that differently or better in our district. And don't be shy. We want to see because it might be helpful to others to see where you're going and to know who they could reach out to for some ideas. Or even if there's things that you learned in this that were a surprise to you, that's helpful to us to plan future trainings as well. Oh, good. OTs have started engaging students in social learning. Excellent. What about school-based mental health providers are added as a related service? Okay. Yep. Um, the question about, are you suggesting that this information you're sharing given to all students? When we talk about multi-level systems of support, we're talking about some of the information around social emotional learning, universal strategies, similar to that Every Moment Counts. That's just to give you a quick idea, because there are tons of different programs like this, and they're not coming to mind. There's a Mr. Turtle one that's used at early childhood. If somebody uses that, feel free to put the name in, but these are programs that are implemented throughout the school, through an elementary school. And I know that Every Moment Counts focuses on the lunchroom and friendship. And there's an element of training for the paras that are in the lunchroom or the lunchroom staff. There's some conversations around it that go on in the classroom. So, in that sense, yes, some of these strategies are for every student. And then as we talk about special ed, certainly based on the student's needs, the things we're talking about are available to every student that has needs in the area of mental health and mental wellness. Any other of my team members have something to add to that? There's a question about, can I clarify the incidental benefit? So that might be a co-taught. The easiest example is a co-taught class for handwriting. An OT would be a part of that room, that classroom. OTs sometimes work in districts to develop a handwriting curriculum, and then they may be the part of teaching. So there's no one student they're focused on, but they are co-teaching with an individual for a portion of instruction, and then those students are receiving incidental benefit from an OT or PT who might be doing an exercise or relaxation kind of training thing, mind breaks. There are a lot of PTs that are doing programs like that where they're coming into classrooms and teaching those kinds of things. So that would be an example of that. Yeah, I know that the stretching time for OT and PT and speech therapists that are contracted is a challenge. The only thing I can say is that the data shows that when there's time allocated, some financial resources allocated for therapists to have a role in these co-serving, co-planning situations, that we see the referrals decrease. And in the long run, there is a benefit. There is a cost benefit. There's a definite benefit to students. And it is absolutely a best practice.
Yeah. This is Tim, and just following along with the comments, this first sort of section that we just went over um, is about universal supports and universal systems. So while we certainly recognize, particularly in rural areas, but not just in rural areas, there's a shortage of school-based occupational therapists and speech language pathologists and school psychologists that can do this support at the universal level. So one of the things we did want to try and get across early on with that mental health as a team sport, and I saw this reflected in the comments as well, that even if you're not a mental health provider, if you don't have training and expertise in mental health interventions and counseling and all that, there are things that schools can do at the systems level um, to create environments and create support for students' mental health at the universal level. So that's where we're at right now. And it doesn't have to be an occupational therapist or a school psychologist that's sort of leading those supports in those systems. I mean, you can find training and supports and lead some systems level work to create an environment that supports student mental health. The one that always jumps out in my mind is our trauma sensitive schools training modules and things. You don't need a mental health expert to start looking into that and start doing some universal things that can really make a difference in supporting student mental health, again, at that universal level. And as we move on, you'll see we are going to get in more into how this looks once we reach that point of special education referral and evaluation and implementing services within the IEP.
I just want to jump in and say there's just a rich conversation going on in the chat. And there's some good questions in there. One from Tammy that talks about, there's so much involvement of county teams as well, CTS teams and so forth that are all involved in this. And I don't know that there's a direct answer, but she poses the question, how do we get everyone, all those individuals involved in that conversation, not just school staff, but county staff, families and so forth? How do we get them around the table to really have these conversations so we can all ensure that we're moving in a similar direction? That's a really good question, and throw it out to the team for thoughts on that. Communication is something that we all strive for, and trying to find times when we can collectively meet. And certainly, virtual options are very valuable these days and become quite productive. Any thoughts on that at all from the team?
And the thing that jumps out in my mind is within our comprehensive school mental health systems, we do have information on what we call referral pathways. I know there's districts all around the state that are doing some really creative things in terms of partnering with service providers, whether it's county or just within the community, if it's a larger community, where they are partnering with different community organizations, either to provide services directly in the school, and they work out ways to make that work. Um, and then again, at the universal level, if you take a look at that comprehensive school mental health framework, part of it is collaboration, not just within the school or within the district, but within the community at large. So because every county, every district is so different and has a variety of different resources and things available, that's really sort of an individual level thing to look at. If you're in a county that has really no mental health service providers within your county or supports, um, you may need to think a little more creatively. And there are some counties out there, some communities that might have just one, and there might be some that have several. So there's no easy answer to that, but it does begin sort of within that comprehensive school mental health system with sort of collaboration and looking around, doing sort of an audit of what you have available, what you don't have available, and ways that you can use those things that you do have.
I'd also just add that part of not only ESSA, but the Safer Communities Act, which is also known as the Gun Control Act, has a large chunk of both of those legislations direct CMS and some other agencies to make funding available to states for these multi-level systems of support, these early intervening mental health services specifically. Um, Many states have already implemented the legislative components that need to be in place to access those monies, which is literally the billions of dollars. Um, I have been, and Dawn and I are part of a stakeholders group, and we're working very closely with our Department of Health and Human Services to move this process along in Wisconsin. We have a number of barriers ourselves in Wisconsin that are slowing this down a little bit for us. But Don and I are pushing at the process as much as we can at this point. But we will, I hope, within maybe the next 3 or 4 months, have some information. And I know you can have all the money in the world, and if you can't find the bodies to implement the programs, as we all know, in those rural areas, that's really tricky. But to do some of this training to supplement some salaries so that people can have opportunities to meet and collaboratively develop programs and ideas, that those monies are going to be very helpful. So there will be information out about it, but at this point, I don't know. But just to know that that's possibly there, hopefully soon. Someone talked about tricky because OTs and PTs and speech therapists that are traveling around often just serve IEP minutes. And I would refer you to the DPI workload versus caseload document and looking at that. And when you are setting up contracts, I would highly encourage you to think about the need for some time for collaboration, not just serving minutes, because some of these things we'll talk about later are those on behalf services. But I think Tim made a good point. We're going to focus on that a little bit more in our next section.
Shall we move on?
Sure. Okay, so now we're going to get a little more of where mental health meets that intersection. We're going to kind of start to move towards that mental health issue for students with disabilities. And those two things do have a point of intersection. I like this visual that it represents. Um, that with all mental health stuff that we just have been talking about sound great, but where is it that we who don't live in this world of a provider who addresses mental health issues, how do we make that intersection, and how do we make those connections with those IEP services, How do we define those minutes? How do we align the services and make sure that that's reflected based on the student's needs in the IEP itself? One of the things we can move to the next slide, Tim. One of the things when we talk about mental health, and I think this comes into play when we look at that explosion of referrals for OTs, particularly in the area of self-regulation, because that's kind of we think of that as synonymous. So I want to take just a minute and think about we need to make this change in our lens. So if you think, if you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. I'm watching the interpreter do that one. It's a good one. Anyway, um, so so this really is going to speak to the issue of sensory integration, self regulation, behavioral regulation, and those kinds of behaviors that we often see in children with um, mental wellness issues, in particular. That would be at that multi level systems of support and those mental health issues that we might need to be addressing in the um, in the IEP. And there are a variety of frames of reference that we can use when we approach this issue of emotional and behavior regulation. So I want to talk about that for just a minute because there's a lot of research that is leading us to make some significant changes in how we look at that and how we provide interventions. So, Don, you want to talk about this one?
Sure, we're going to digress for just a moment to talk about emotional regulation and the brain. How our brains function has always been a passion of mine, and we don't have time to go into detail on this today. So this is a very simplified version of brain functioning. We often see dysregulation in students with mental health concerns, and this slide represents a way to view the brain and the ability to self-regulate. It was developed by Dr. Daniel Siegel, and it's a hand model used to explain the key functions of the brain. So you have your thinking area or your cortex, your feeling area or your limbic system, and your survival, the brainstem, including your fight, flight, freeze, and collapse. And when disruptions occur impacting our reactions, it's often referred to as flipping your lid. So the brain is offline when that happens and it's difficult to think and communicate. So as we continue with today's presentation and we move into the topic of comprehensive special education evaluations, we want to think about how a student's mental health can impact their ability to think, their level of emotional flexibility. For instance, are they constantly in a fight flight mode? And this may impact their ability to communicate, to engage in adult-directed activities, to focus, and also their ability to learn. So on the next slide, we have some ways to describe behavior. Unfortunately, when a student is dysregulated, this often results in labeling of negative behavior and personality traits. And here are some examples of ways to more specifically describe behaviors that we observe. This will be helpful when we complete that root cause analysis to determine disability-related needs or barriers in a student's ability to access, engage, and make progress in their educational program. And I'll turn it back to Tim.
Very briefly turn it to me because I believe many of you attending today have heard us talk perhaps ad nauseum about comprehensive special education evaluations. For those of you that have not, there's a link on the next slide that you can take a look at our comprehensive evaluation materials. But the gist of it is that when a student's referred for an evaluation, there's really two main things that need to be evaluated for. One is whether or not the child is a child with a disability. So do they meet the criteria for, excuse me, one or more of those IDEA category criteria? And then you need to evaluate to determine what content will go into the student's IEP. So information that's going to help them be involved in progress, make progress in the curriculum or age-appropriate activities. So it's really that second part that we really emphasize in our comprehensive special ed evaluation framework. And we do that through encouraging teams to ask educationally relevant questions. Meaning asking questions about how the student's functioning academically, socially, emotionally, behaviorally, in all these areas that are going to make a difference in whether or not they can access, engage, and make progress in the curriculum. And those educationally relevant questions, we recommend teams sort of look at these different assessment areas or areas of functioning, not just looking at what impairment category might this student fit into, but really looking at how is the student functioning cognitively, physically, in these different domains of functioning rather than just thinking about categories. So looking at what our evaluation is designed to identify what needs does this student have as opposed to what label will we apply to this student. And then, of course, ultimately identifying that criteria is part of the evaluation, but it's necessary, but it's not sufficient when it comes to really doing an evaluation that's going to ultimately end up in identifying the right supports and services the student needs.
The model that you see on this slide is from the World Health Organization. It's the International Classification of Functioning, Disability, and Health. A lot of our literature in related services refers to this diagram, and looking at a way, it's a common language for describing human functioning and disability, as well as a framework that we can use for gathering data and measuring outcomes. One of the best things about the ICF is it's helping us to transition from an impairment model to an enablement model or social model of considering disability. And looking at the social model for assessment and intervention. So the ICF framework facilitates consideration of the individual's social, educational, vocational activities, and how they participate in their education. It focuses teams on ways to modify contextual factors to reduce those barriers and enhance facilitators of successful spoken and also written communication. There's been a shift in our evidence-based literature from a focus on sensory processing and integration to an emphasis on the functional performance challenges from these problems. So when we include a participation-based assessment in our evaluation process, we're more likely to make a connection between regulation and the ability to perform daily tasks. If there's a barrier to the child's ability to participate and engage in daily routines, or as Carlin described, occupational performance, and we suspect sensory processing to be a factor, then we need to start measuring the effectiveness of the intervention to a change in the occupational performance. So it's not only a change in zone of regulation.
Dawn, I just want to add one thing to this, that one of the things that I love, a phrase that I love that goes along with this idea of this shifting from this medical model to a social model of disability, is this idea that one is only as disabled as their environment makes them.
Mhm.
And I think that's powerful. It's powerful for us when we look at multi-level systems of support, but it's particularly powerful when we look at that in the context of our physically disabled students. So making that shift to a focus on what is the activity we want to perform, and then you see on this diagram that box about body function and structure. That's often where OTs, PTs, and SLPs have focused our interventions, and there's a preponderance of evidence that says that's not effective in leading to functional outcomes. What leads to functional outcomes are more of those strategies that look at environment, look at modifications in the curriculum, look at those personal factors within the student, um, and then again, really constantly monitoring, does this intervention increase their participation? Thanks for letting me add that, Dawn.
Absolutely. So the next slide shows that we have flipped from having that health condition being the primary focus to putting participation on the top of our diagram. And then when we look at the activities, we've added the 6 areas of academic and functional performance for your consideration. We've incorporated that so that we can gather we can gather data and plan our interventions based on what we see in activities within these 6 areas. So there's a clear need to complete a comprehensive special education evaluation and develop interventions that specifically target participation, as Carlin was talking about. So rather than anticipating activities-based intervention, it'll result in participation gains. And if we only look at body structure and function, we end up writing body structure and function goals. And the evidence clearly says that this will not change participation, engagement, and educational progress.
Mm. Okay, again, just we don't want to keep reiterating, but just briefly, the switch is that this comprehensive special education switch is an approach that all teams should be moving toward. It is required by law, and it's the right thing to do to meet students. It's shifting away from looking at, oh, the student, we think the student has an emotional behavioral disability, or we have a student coming into our building who has an outside diagnosis of depression, anxiety, bipolar, whatever, not looking at that and driving our assessments and our evaluation based on those labels, but moving to, what information do we need to gather in order to determine eligibility and, more importantly, identify those strengths and needs of the students. As someone who previously served as a special education diagnostician, my role was really looking at those initial evaluations for students suspected of having an emotional behavioral disability. And I really think about how that label drove so much of the work that we did versus really looking at that child as a whole. If you're a hammer, everything looks like a nail. So we need to move away from that and look at that whole child and their strengths and needs. And then just another real quick recap, we have to look at we do have to look at what IDEA category that student fits into it. That is a requirement, but it's not enough. We have to acknowledge that special education services are not determined by the label. Law requires teams to assess comprehensively to identify the needs of the individual student, and knowing that students with autism can have mental health needs. We know there's a correlation of that. Students with a significant specific learning disability may have social emotional learning needs, or a student with an emotional behavioral disability may have academic needs. That's to say that comprehensive school special ed evaluation is not driven by label, and neither are their needs. And this graphic summarizes that relationship between the areas of academic and functional skill and the questions that every comprehensive evaluation must answer, like Tim mentioned, as we look into that, as we move through that evaluation process. And that's, does the student meet criteria for a disability category? And more importantly, what are the student's educational needs helpful for IEP development? And looking at this comprehensively is so efficient. It really puts the time up front and saves time in the back end. Again, working in districts as a special education administrator, there were so many times we got to the table after that 60-day timeline, and someone would ask a question about, well, what about their cognitive learning? Or, did we know that student comes from a dual language home? Or I have some questions about their communication skills that may be impacting their social emotional learning. And those are questions asked at that 60-day timeline, where we need to be asking those questions up front and really looking at it comprehensively from the beginning. And it's not that we're asking IEP teams to assess everything. We just want to make sure that we don't miss anything.
And one of the things that hopefully you're hearing a few times so far today is while the label, whether it's an IDEA label or a mental health diagnosis, while that's sort of helpful information and at times a necessary component of an evaluation, it's not the only thing that we need to do. So oftentimes, even I pretty regularly get questions about, well, if a student has a mental health diagnosis, that's a mental health problem that belongs over here. It's not a special education thing. So what we try and emphasize is that if a student has a mental health condition, a diagnosed mental health disorder or anything like that, even if it's just a parent that says, my child has such and such, of a challenge or a condition or a diagnosis, that doesn't mean that student needs special education, but it also doesn't preclude them from being eligible for special education. We still have a child find obligation to sort of figure out what that student's needs are. So when a student has a mental health diagnosis, or you'll see in the next slide, or when they have experienced a traumatic experience, that's not an automatic rule into special education, nor is it a rule out. The IEP team has an obligation to sort of do a comprehensive evaluation to determine whether or not those symptoms or those behaviors or those things related to that mental health condition um, meet with the characteristics of a disability. And then through that evaluation, you're using that information together to identify disability related needs. Sorry, I want to go back to that briefly because I do want to point out the link on this slide specifically. It's a recently updated or created resource that I believe we published maybe just this past fall that talks about how IEP teams should and must incorporate medical and clinical information, which would include things from psychiatrists, community-based counselors, psychologists, things like that, into the evaluation and the IEP development. It's a handy resource to help teams sort of think through, okay, we've gotten this report from this child's counselor or psychiatrist, what do we do with it?
And Tim, I would just add real quick, if I could, that the other part of that document that I think is very helpful is it kind of walks you through that process then, and it aligns with our presentation today in using that CCR IEP process and taking that medical information from a community provider and helping the team to determine, is that information or that knowledge about the student adding additional information about barriers for that student to access and engage. And so not only including the information, but then a conversation in the context of the CCR IEP process that leads us to say, well, actually, we've got these supports in place, and that's not a barrier, but thank you for providing the information, or saying, oh my gosh, we now see additional barriers. So I think that part of this document can be particularly helpful.
Thanks, Carolyn. Another mental health related concern, issue, question, series, category of questions that we often get is, what about when mental health is a barrier for the student, even just attending school, even to get to school? How do we provide services to ensure FAPE? How do we support this student to get them to school so they can access, make progress, and engage in the curriculum? So another fairly recent resource that we've published, Eva and some of my colleagues on the Student Services Prevention and Wellness team put together a really nice FAQ on how to address mental health challenges that are contributing to truancy, which anyone who listens to the news or reads the newspaper knows that post-pandemic, this has been sort of exacerbated. So it goes through information like, well, how do we know when we're looking at these mental health issues that are contributing to truancy? How do we know when it's time to do a referral and an evaluation? And it addresses things like, well, if the student's truant and they're not coming to school, is that just automatically an exclusionary factor from the student being eligible for special ed services? And then things that teams should consider, schools should consider to address the student's truancy when the student has an IEP, both within and around the IEP. The last thing I want to touch on briefly before I believe Carlin is going to talk a little more in depth about trauma is that when a student has experienced or is experiencing trauma or the impact of trauma in their lives, that it really can affect their, again, access, engagement, and progress in the general education curriculum. It affects functioning in all sorts of different areas, as you can see on this slide, everything from learning to their regulation, attention. We've already touched on attendance and Dawn talked about language development earlier. So all of these things can have an impact on the students' engagement, progress, access to the general education curriculum, and towards their IEP goals. So again, one sort of key point that we're just trying to make here is within that comprehensive evaluation process, you don't need to diagnose this student has experienced trauma. What we're looking for are those things, those needs that a student has, those disability related needs, regardless of whether they're due to language challenges or development, or as Carlin talked about, their occupation of school and those skills, their regulation, their social emotional learning, whatever it may be. We really want teams to do that comprehensive evaluation to take a look at what are this student's disability related needs and how can we address those needs.
Thanks. Tim, well, you're going to do this one still? I'm sorry. No, that's me. Sorry. I was reading the question in the parking lot here to see if one of you guys want to read that real quickly. I'll talk about this slide, and if this is something we can answer, feel free to just pop in. Um, Dawn talked a little bit, Dawn and I are kind of neuro physiology and neurobiology nerds. And I think it really is important to think about how the brain functions and what actually happens. If you're familiar at all with the term of epigenetics, it has a huge impact on actual brain development, particularly the limbic system and the reticular activating system, those systems that have a huge amount to do with how our memory attaches to our reaction system. So that has particularly significant issues in the area of trauma, and then that connection to later mental health, how we cope, how we see the world around us, all of those kinds of things. And then when we think about that, um, how that leads then to those kinds of behaviors that we see, and the different ways that that connects with that skill of self regulation, emotional regulation, emotional flexibility, and behavioral regulation. So let's look at this next slide. One of the things that um, we talked about was, as we were preparing for this, that we have like probably 3 or 4 separate areas within today's presentation that deserved a whole day to themselves. And this probably is also one of those topics, but we're trying to give it to you together in a way that makes sense about kind of that, as I said earlier, that big picture. And, we really need to think about to make a shift in terms of how we see self regulation behaviors. And again, some of those things I'll be presenting to you later is some information and some relatively new in the last 10 years. And in the large scheme of things, that's relatively new. Data about the effectiveness of many of those go to strategies. One of these days, I'm going to use the blow your mind emoji when I talk about it, because it takes us away from some of the things that we view as tried and true interventions to some others. But we'll get to that in a minute. But it's really critical for us to begin to see that some of those dysregulation, emotional regulation impairments that we see are really coping strategies, which requires a totally different approach. And that sometimes those aggressive behaviors are really coming from that fight or flight, and can be rooted in trauma, can be rooted in a mental health disorder, a lack of capacity to understand a situation. Again, that's where that environment and the strategies we use can really impact that. That hyperactive, chaotic, kind of clumsy can be part of that fight or flight or freeze we often see when they appear to be bored or distracted. That may be really a component of that freezing part. And we really need to understand, what is the student's regulation like? Am I seeing signs of fight, flight, or freeze? And I think this is one of those intersections in today's presentation where we jump to often the conclusion that this is self regulation, it's synonymous with sensory integration, therefore, we need an OT. And I think what this literature informs us is that there are a lot of skilled team members that can kind of begin to look at those dysregulated behaviors and shift in that lens from not making the assumption that it's a kind of old school way of looking at sensory integration, but an understanding that the sensory processing system is a part of our overall ability of our brain to self regulate, and that there are a variety of factors that play into that skill. One of the things that, as I just want to mention real quickly, is you can go ahead and shift him because I can just say this that, one of the things that's the most important, and I think that's important for teams to think about as they get to that process of figuring out how they're going to support the student, that relationship is critical. And so we have to think about how we develop relationship with our students, that's a really important part. So, this on this slide, thanks, Tim, is. Again, this is coming from that. There's an article if you're interested in this or want to pass it on. Sorry about that. To an OT or PT, SLP in your district, or other people, reach out to me and I'll be happy to share the article with you. But again, it looks at that need to investigate, kind of to see the behavior as just the behavior, not make an assumption about what's causing it, and really take all of that into consideration. So we can see in this next slide that these are kind of the common quote unquote sensory things that prompt an OT evaluation. And yet we see the variety of um, conditions. And we should have added to this. I see now this was kind of my responsibility with this slide, but I would now add to this mental wellness, that we see these same kinds of things, the stereotypic behaviors, self injurious behaviors, emotional regulation, and that understanding that self regulation is dependent upon specific environmental and contextual supports for the student, and which is, I hope, kind of opening your eyes to that idea of that comprehensive assessment. Again, using a framework, either like the ICF or the Riot ISIL, which helps you look at areas of function and participation and consider all of the variables that may be providing or may be presenting a barrier for that child's ability to access, engage, and make progress.
Okay, as we near break, I just wanted to take a couple minutes to talk about why we are seeing more difficulty in areas of mental wellness and an explosion of referrals related to mental health issues. One of the factors that bears consideration is the impact of screen time. Again, this could be an entire presentation, but briefly, a child's language environment is a critical factor for brain maturation. And brain maturation depends on and facilitates language development and self-regulation. Language development is the foundation for social emotional skills, executive function skills, and academic skills, which you see intertwined on this diagram. And research related to screen time, which occurred even prior to the recent national pandemic, shows actual changes in brain function and the capacity to take in information and learn over time. Screen time diminishes the quantity and the quality of the interactions between children and their caregivers, and it results in fewer chances to practice and develop those language skills. It also results in significantly lower emotional scores, higher risk of conduct problems, learning problems, and difficulties with impulsivity and hyperactivity. So we need to be thoughtful about not just making assumptions about what we're seeing on the surface when we're making observations and considering delay or disorder in a comprehensive special education evaluation. And also consider, can changes be made at a universal level in the classroom environment to help with regulation? I think that's the farthest we can go on this topic for today, but if you are interested in more of the research on screen time and brain development, certainly contact me and I can share some of that with you. All right, so we've come to the end of the first half. So we've talked about a link of mental health services to your MLSS system, ways to gather data and things to bring to the evaluation and later to the IEP development, which can impact access, engagement, and progress. as we talk about the IEP in the next section. And we really want to make sure that you're considering who can bring the data for the evaluation portion when we get to that IEP development, and that it's not just your school psychologist, your social worker and guidance counselor, but it's a team process and a lot of people can bring that information. Anything else you want to add to that summary, Tim, before we move on to our break?
No, let's go ahead and take a break. I don't know, it's 10:15 exactly. Wow, how did we do that?
You guys are right on time.
When you come back at 10:30, I do promise, please come back. The rest of the session will be much more engaging and interactive. We won't just be talking at you.
And I wanted to know, someone asked for a link to the article, and I've put it in the chat, and I'll put it in again in just a little bit in case people lose it in the chat.
Thanks, team. We'll be back. All right, we've got a nice, we'll be back at 10:30. Whenever you're ready, we can begin again.
We're missing the driver of our slide deck. Waiting for Tim to keep us moving, because what we're going to be moving into is we're going to be looking at the intersection of the comprehensive, oh, there's Tim.
Mm.
Hey, Tim, I'll let you take over.
Oh, all right. Okay, so Deb, your question from the parking lot, I think we will address specifically as we get into the IEP development. So I do want to get back to Tanya's question regarding like, well, what's the right number of students who should receive an IEP, I believe was the gist of it. So that's another sort of it depends question. To me, the best way to address it, because sort of national numbers and even state numbers can vary from district to district in terms of the number or percentage of students who have IEPs. There's a couple of key things to consider for me. One is you can't make those decisions based on what we have available in terms of staff and resources. Those need to be made on an individual basis based on student need. And obviously we know when it comes to shortages and things like that, that can take some creativity and can put a sort of heavy burden on your staff. So you definitely want to be thinking about things like compassion resilience, compassion fatigue, and how to support staff who are providing the services and things. And the other thing when it comes to like, you had mentioned, Tanya, like post-pandemic, seeing the increased mental health supports and needs. One, again, go down those parallel tracks, work on your universal systems of support, training your general ed classroom staff, administrative staff, and how we can sort of at a systems level support student mental health. And then when it comes to like evaluation and referrals and that part of the system is think about through our comprehensive special education evaluation systems and resources, really think about how your teams are assessing and evaluating that second question. What are the students' disability related needs? Does the student have a need for specially designed instruction? So it's not just, well, every student who has anxiety or depression or ADHD or whatever it might be needs an IEP. Really think about that question. What is specially designed instruction? Who needs it and how do we provide it? So that second question in the evaluation is really the key to be thinking about in terms of how we support students. Because if you look at post-pandemic data in terms of percentage of students who might have some sort of mental health diagnosis or mental health challenges, it's a lot of kids. But that doesn't mean every kid needs an IEP or needs that specially designed instruction. So I'm going to move us along a little bit. So we've talked about that comprehensive school mental health system, those universal supports and strategies. And then we talked a little bit about comprehensive evaluation and how to look at things like trauma, self-regulation skills, all those things that we need to look at in terms of identifying students' disability-related needs. Now we're going to go into how those things from our universal system through our evaluation, then down to how to create an IEP and how to incorporate supporting student mental health within the IEP. So we talked initially when we first started about the definition of mental health, that it is just sort of part of health. Next, we're going to point out there's a couple of areas within the IEP where we sort of directly see connections between mental health, mental wellness, well-being, and requirements or concepts within IDEA. One is within that definition of what is mental health, that a student feels or that an individual feels fulfillment and satisfaction with life, that they can work productively, make contributions to the community. Boy, that sounds an awful lot like what IEP teams do when they are doing post-secondary transition planning. We're asking the student, what is it that you want once you leave our school, once you leave our district, once you start to become an adult? And then another component of that mental health within our comprehensive school mental health definition within our model, that an individual has the ability to cope with everyday life stressors. And boy, doesn't that sound an awful lot like what an IEP team does when they're talking about, does a student have behaviors that impede with their learning or the learning of others, and what positive behavior intervention supports can we provide to that student to help them cope with everyday life stressors, because they come across some stressors when they're going through school, through their school day. And then again, the final component of mental health that really sort of has a pretty direct line to IEP development is just the provision of FAPE, that someone who has mental wellness or just positive health has the ability to realize, or has the opportunity to realize their abilities. And that's really, when it comes right down to it, what FAPE is and what providing it within the least restrictive environment is. And we know from, again, the Andrew F. decision that we're looking for more than just de minimis progress, that just this moving from year to year, from IEP to IEP, isn't enough, according to the Andrew F. decision, that we really do need to think about what FAPE and what progress looks like in the least restrictive environment to help that student, that child, reach their or realize their abilities. So there are definitely some direct parallels between sort of mental health, wellness, and what we do when we're developing IEPs for students who may have some mental health challenges.
Okay, so we're going to jump in.
Sorry, trying to mute, Eva. Carry on.
Okay, sorry. We're going to take a look at mental health and the CCR IEP 5-step process, the College Career Ready IEP 5-step process, which I always look at as a continuous improvement process. Part of this is our hope to demystify mental health services and supports in the IEP and make sure that we continue to look at it as a team sport. Through this process, we look at the barriers to a student's ability to access, engage, and make progress in age or grade level education, curriculum, instruction, activities, and environments. And we look at the services and supports the student needs in order to help reduce or minimize those barriers. So what we're going to do in the next little bit is we're going to look at each step and identify ways that teams can consider mental health needs and incorporate the services and supports to meet those needs. And we'll have a couple of times where we'll be doing some activities related to that. So first, we're going to jump into step 1 of that 5-step process. In step 1, teams are required to document a student's present level of academic achievement and functional performance compared to age and grade level peers, and they need to use data from multiple sources. Social and emotional learning is one type of functional performance area, and IEP teams can certainly utilize the Wisconsin DPI SEL competencies or the Wisconsin Model Early Learning Standards to help in documenting and identifying a student's social and emotional strengths and needs related to their age and grade level peers. IEP teams also want to consider college and career readiness skills, including independence, self-advocacy, resilience, and coping skills in relation to that access, engagement, and achievement of grade level standards and functional expectations. So this is step one. And then when we look at it, the academic and functional achievement, we need to address the relationship between the two. Doing so leads to IEP teams focused on improved student outcomes. And we have to look at the relationship. Looking at the relationship between the two also helps teams look at the collective responsibility to supporting that student's needs in order to improve outcomes. So academic achievement gaps may affect access to instruction and understanding how to engage with the instruction. And functional achievement gaps may affect motivation, regulation, and relationships, among other things. And the IEP team may identify gaps in the student's regulation, say, as an example, regulation skills that affect their reading achievement, or they may have gaps in reading skills that impact their regulation. So the team really wants to work together and explore how each and every member can support the student in their ability to access and engage in grade level instruction. And they have to think about how that collaboration, that ongoing collaboration, how maybe the special education teacher is working with the occupational therapist to provide supports to the students so they can better access their reading instruction through better regulation. And remembering that it's not one sole person's responsibility. This really is a team sport. So it may be that, say, the speech language pathologist, therapist, or occupational therapist is providing some support to the special ed teacher in knowing how to help instruct those skills or support that access. It's really that ongoing collaboration and making sure that we have that collective responsibility as we look at the interplay between these two skill sets. And again, kind of looking at the connection between the two, which is really a precursor to kind of our next discussion on disability-related needs, is really looking at that underlying barrier. We have to really look at, those specific academic skills, and then look at what is the barrier to the that student's ability to improve outcomes in those skills. And through that IEP process, we can identify, we can support a student's mental health needs through the supports or instruction we provide based on that data that we collected earlier and that comprehensive special education evaluation, which could possibly include a functional behavioral assessment. And again, there's such an interplay between these two sets of skills. Obviously, if we have a student who's struggling with some executive functioning skills like planning or organization, that's going to impact their reading, and vice versa. If they're struggling with reading, that may affect their sense of self-worth or their, self-regulation. So we really have to be looking at the interplay between these two and making sure that we're supporting the whole child and not just focusing on the fact that maybe they have some reading skill deficits and only focusing on reading. But as I said, we're going to look at it from that bigger picture of what are the underlying barriers and not just take that surface. And I think that's where we go next with Carlin talking about effects of disability and disability-related needs.
That is correct. The other thing that I wanted to just share real quick, Eva, you and Dawn and I talked about this yesterday afternoon. It isn't the focus of today's presentation, but I just want to commend to you again. There are some frameworks that help IEP teams think through that process of looking at the whole child and what is the intersection of various barriers that the child may have or present with that impact those various areas of both academic and functional performance. And one of those is the riot ISIL. So again, DPI is encouraging us to think about using some of these frameworks. That ICF could be a tool that might be helpful depending on the culture in your district, or the riot ISIL, or just using those 6 areas of academic and functional performance, and have, this is that collaborative process of data collection, assessment, and looking at it in the context of those areas of function, academic and functional performance. So I wanted to mention that. So I know that, having worked in numerous districts and consulted and coached various providers in districts, that this step in particular, is one that we tend to scoot by because we think it's going to take too much time in the IEP meeting. And it's really important is that at least consideration, some kind of structure that helps a team have a conversation about identifying the effects of the disability. And one of the terms that we like to use is, to kind of help break that mindset that we're not talking about disability related needs in that they have to be related to the special education disability category. They have to be any barrier that is impacting that child's ability to access and engage and make progress in their education. So what are the effects? What are the nature and characteristics of that impairment, that barrier that we see? What are some of the root causes of that barrier? And that helps us to then develop more clarity around that child's disability related needs, or those barriers to their educational program, which, it really does help teams to better then clarify what the goals need to be, what the supports need to be. And when we talk about, it's confusing for people at times when we say, well, we want you to develop non-discipline specific goals. There shouldn't be a goal for the OT and a goal for the SLP, but there should be goals for the student's ability to participate. And then we look at how do we best support the student's ability to achieve that goal. So if we go to this next slide, I really like people to think about that, in this next slide. Tim, are you
Yeah, I
there?
just want to jump in real quick, Carly,
Yeah,
because
yeah, please do.
we did have a question about um, do the goals and services and things need to tie to the student's disability? And this is a really key slide for that is what IDEA, what the federal regs say is you need to identify and provide services and supports for students um, to meet their needs, whether or not they are um, traditionally associated with that particular disability category. So that's really why Carlin's emphasizing this step is really important, because you're not tying the goals and the services to the student's impairment category or their disability, but what that student's individual needs are um, that that come from that disability. So not all students that have specific learning disability have the exact same disability related needs, which is why this is so important.
Yes, and I think, thanks, Tim, so much. I think this is too where the NDRF decision gives us very clear guidance about that. And it's kind of forcing us to understand we need to look at every need that child has in relationship to their ability to access, engage, and participate. Dawn and I field the question often, how is it that OT or, well, OT or PT could be a need on a student who's identified as a speech and language impairment student? And where would OT fit in that? Well, we need to really clearly identify what are their needs, and some of those might be non-traditional speech and language things. And again, I would say that when we get to this goal part, then a goal for the student, the other place where people get confused is, well, how would OT attach to a speech and language goal? Well, we want people to stop thinking about goals as being owned by a discipline. A goal might be for a student to improve their communication. And if, as we were talking about earlier, as Eva was talking about, if their self regulation skills or impairments are impacting their ability to communicate in some way, and that data has been presented in the evaluation report and in the present level of performance, then we can identify a need in relationship to self regulation and that then we would have a self-regulation goal, not an OT goal, but a student's goal around the ability to, or it might be that they would utilize self-regulation strategies so they can more calmly talk about their feelings when they're angry. That's a kind of a loose example, but I like to say that this is really where the magic happens, is step two, as we're engaging in this root cause analysis of what's causing the communication problems. I'll kind of stick with that analogy. And obviously, an SLP is going to bring some ideas to that conversation. And OT might bring some ideas to that conversation. And we really want to look at that. What are the barriers to that child's ability to perform that uh, component of participation? So this is that deeper level discussion of why is this happening? Um, in the early trainings, we talked about the 5 whys, and we're not necessarily saying you must ask that question why 5 times, but we are hopeful that teams will do that. I will tell you, it does help when we look at then adding related services. If we've had a good conversation at this level, it does help downstream to talk about then what are the educational reasons that we might also need related service providers, and especially with that team sport idea as we look at mental health. Once in a while, the OT or the speech and language pathologist may bring data to the team. There's a line from the OT-PT resource guide that says one should not assume that the professional person who's assessing a particular area necessarily needs to provide the intervention in that particular area. So that's that idea that we all come at this as team players and provide that information, but that ability to have that conversation is really rooted in this step two. So again, it's that important part of asking those questions. What are we seeing? First of all, I guess the first question is, what do we want the child to be able to do? So whether it's in that area of communication, using those 6 areas of academic and functional performance, or Riot ISIL, or the ICF, what is it that we need that student to do and to do better? Where do we see a gap in their achievement academically or functioning in relationship to their same age and grade peers? So what are we seeing? And then that question of why are we seeing it? And I think, there's that little reminder there in the lower right hand corner that strengths are important too, because we need to be able to say, wow, in this environment, Johnny's able to do this, or with this support strategy, they're able to do this. And when we bring in those strengths in relationship to actual functional things, building on those a little bit more than just Susie has a great sense of humor and her peers like her, but those actual strengths that the student brings in kind of how they think about things, how they approach things. We want to be sure that we mention that because those are great opportunities to scaffold information. I also wanted to whoops, I lost my page here. Sorry. Um, I just want to ask the team real quickly, are we answering questions as they pop up, or are we just going to wait? Because there was a really good one about related services that I wanted to clarify, and I don't know if somebody could just, Tim or Eva or Don, tell me, do we want to just take a minute or keep going and get to those at the end?
We're doing good on time, so if it's sort of on topic
It
of where we're at
is.
in the session,
Yep.
go ahead and
Yep.
answer it, I think.
I will, thanks. Okay, so the question, I wrote it down here. Someone asked in regard to the slide about the role of related service providers, and the question was phrased, quote, if I understand correctly, it was shared that intervention, direct, indirect, can only be provided through special education. I wanted to clarify that that is not true. When we were talking about the role of related service providers in multi-level systems of support, those direct services, either assessment, making student specific recommendations. Teacher comes to me and says, Johnny's not doing blah, blah, blah right. Could you come take a look at him and give me some suggestions? That can't be done. But OTs and PTs can have a role in universal strategy development, co planning, co serving in a variety of ways to implement programs that have a universal design in nature. So I really wanted to clarify that. The other question that was there that I think Don might want to weigh in on this, or Tim and Eva, but with the cause of outside factors such as screen time, trauma, what does DPI see as responsibility of school districts to remediate the students' behavioral or mental health needs? What's the responsibility of the parents and caregivers? And I think this question in particular is perfect for this section of what we're talking about. If that student has behaviors that are that are serving as a barrier to their ability to access and engage in their educational program, then we need to look at that. We need to have a conversation about that, and we do have responsibility for addressing those barriers so that they can better engage in their educational program. Anybody else on the team want to add to that real quick? And otherwise, I'll go on. We're good? Okay, let's go to the next slide, Tim. So when we talk about self-regulation, I talked a little bit earlier about we need to kind of shift our way of looking at those behaviors that we've jumped at labeling as sensory integration. The student has sensory integration needs when it's really they have self-regulation needs. And that's a much bigger uh, question and a much bigger issue and has a broader implication when we think about evidence based intervention strategies. So, the ability to self regulate is the act of managing thoughts and feelings and engaging in goal directed activities and being able to organize ourselves, controlling impulsive behaviors, and being able to problem solve and perform sequential step by step um, kinds of processes. Um, and I mentioned before that this ability in many of the students we work with can be dependent on the environment, can be dependent on the relationship with a particular person, can be dependent on consistency and how we do things. So, we're going to talk a little bit later about some of the more evidence based strategies to do that. But I really want us, particularly as we're having this conversation about mental wellness and mental health, to think about self regulation as this broad thing under which sensory processing can play a role, but self regulation is not synonymous with sensory integration. Let's look at the next slide. So when we think about the components of self-regulation that impact function, we've talked about, I think all of us have kind of mentioned in one way or another, these variables: emotional regulation, cognitive regulation, social perspective taking, and then sensory processing and sensory integration is also a part of that. And I think and I think that's why Dawn and I felt we wanted to include some of those slides about brain function, and those areas of the brain that function, those areas that become impaired through a variety of etiologies, that when we think about those things, we need to think about then that there are a wide variety of evidence based options for intervention. And I don't want to go through, spend a lot of time, that's not the purpose of today, but I put the things in that lower right hand box just to say, look at all of these other strategies that are evidence based that we really need to be thoughtful about, that aren't owned by, and again, this is that idea that we're team players. So, that idea that there's a number of people on the team that have skills in all of these areas, have extra knowledge, expertise, training, not just OTs, that can help provide programming and interventions, supplementary aids and services that address those issues. The other thing I wanted to say real quickly, and please feel free to reach out to me. I know Tim probably has a ton of resources around this as well, but I've accumulated a variety of resources that are more uh, uh, participation based, functionally based assessments of social emotional learning. Some of them have been developed by OTs. Some of them are not owned by OT at all, but I use them. Anybody could use them. But if your district is looking for ways to assess that, I'm sure Tim would be able to share some resources with you. And I also have a bibliography or a list of things like that. So feel free to reach out to me by email and I can get that to you. Let's see if this next one is going to Dawn.
Now we move on to step 3 of the CCR IEP process in developing goals. And when we're looking at step 3, we want to develop ambitious and achievable annual IEP goals designed with the intent of closing those individual achievement gaps. And we're going to improve the access, engagement, and progress related to the effects of the disability and those disability-related needs that you determined in step 2. So the IEP goals support the unique strengths and needs of the student. We're going to use the information discussed previously and summarized in the disability-related needs section to develop these goals. We're going to address why, or the root cause, the student's not meeting those early childhood or grade level standards and expectations, and address student-specific disability-related needs, as Tim mentioned, whether or not commonly linked to the category or the label. And what we also want to make sure when you're looking at developing those goals is that they are skill-based. So when we address participation level, goals should reflect skills and those barriers to performance when we're writing those. So by connecting the IEP goals to the disability-related need, we ensure that we address the root cause, that they're not meeting the standards. We focus on the root cause and limit the number of goals to those really needed to address those disability-related needs. On the next slide, we have a way of looking at bringing in again those 6 areas and developing goals that are not necessarily discipline specific, but looking at needs from the unique lens of the different team members. So when we look at those 6 areas here, we've highlighted social and emotional learning for our example in this case, and we can look at different impacts on performance. Maybe a student has difficulty with focus or attention, difficulty with self-awareness, social communication skills, and maybe we see impulsive decision-making on behalf of the student. So we can identify those barriers or those disability-related needs and then develop a collaborative goal that multiple IEP team members can address through their unique lens. And so we have an example of that on the next slide. If we've determined that the student has a disability-related need in the area of social emotional skills, we can look at a goal such as, with adult support, the student will use learned strategies. So some of those strategies might be to move, to request a break, or ask others if they can to move, take a deep breath. Other strategies that you may come up with would fit there as well. And that would help them to manage those strong emotions so they can participate in an entire academic or non-academic group activity. Of course, you would include your baseline that you've determined through gathering data, a level of attainment, maybe some benchmarks if those are needed, and then how you're going to measure progress for this goal. Again, we want it to be skill-based and growth related to need. Okay, and now we're going to look at an activity. Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, it's your turn. So I'm going to drop into the chat here unless someone beats me to it. An activity sheet that basically starts with disability-related needs. It has some examples there. I beat you, Eva. Now you got it twice. Has some examples of mental health sort of related disability-related needs, followed by other components of the IEP. So what we're going to do, since we've gone through CCR's step 1, 2, and 3, is we'd like to have you go through those first 3 steps using either the examples that are on the activity sheet. You can just pick one, or if you'd prefer to choose your own, if you have a student in mind that you've been working with, that you've identified some mental health related, disability related needs, go ahead and use your own example. But we're going to have you go into breakout groups about the size of an IEP team. So choose a disability related need or create your own, and then come up with some annual goals, including, and you'll see on the sheet, the procedures for measuring student progress. That's an important part of annual goals that address that disability related needs. So again, that question in the chat about, does the student, do the goals and services need to align with the disability? No, they need to align with the need. So you have some examples there of the need. and see if you can come up with a goal, maybe a couple of goals, as well as ways to measure progress toward that goal that address the disability related need you chose. And is it Deb? Are you sending people into breakout rooms for us?
Yes, I am. And I just might need to do just a little switching around, but